Hello, today I'm here to tell you about the most disturbing books that I've ever read, which I will likely never pick up again. Now, this video title is perhaps leaning a bit into clickbait, because some of the books on this list I would maybe recommend to specific people who I know could handle the dark topics within these books. But generally, most of these are books that I found difficult to read, too dark to fully enjoy, or hard to bring up in casual conversation. And that's why I've categorized these as my unrecommendable books. These are the kinds of books that you need to be speaking to a book lover about, and even then, we gotta check that our genre preferences align. I am a huge horror lover. I am certainly not adverse to darker themes in literature, and I'm pretty proud of being able to handle some dark stuff. But I think when you're into horror, and generally darker content, you gotta know your time and place to discuss these things, and also to learn the value of these themes and what they're there to teach us, and when these are not used effectively, or if the surrounding content is just bad. So, with that in mind, this is your warning. I'm gonna talk about some dark literature today. Here's my list of the most fucked up books I've ever read. I want to start with Lapvona by Ottessa Moshfegh, which I had my eye on for a long time because the cover always made me look twice, just look at it, and I knew this author from her other book, My Year of Rest and Relaxation, which I've yet to read but is apparently wildly popular. And after reading Lapvona, I am left questioning, is that other book this fucked up? This book is a dark, twisted medieval fable that takes place in the titular village of Lapvona, a fiefdom which is riddled with corruption and famine. We follow a 13-year-old Marek who lives in the shadow of his aggressively abusive father Jude, the local shepherd. Marek somewhat accidentally commits a crime against someone of a higher social standing than him, and in order to repay his crime, he is sent to live with and entertain the feudal lord William in his castle, where Marek is then exposed to the inner workings of a cruel, vile, corrupt, noble life. We spend half the book getting to know the village of Lapvona, witnessing the cruel abuse that Marek is subjected to by his father, and also being introduced to and learning more about the ancient village witch, who, by the way, nursed both Marek and Jude when they were younger. The other half of the book is Varric then living in William's castle, where decadence, debauchery, and what's the third D word? Depravity? is given to us through William, his servant characters, and possibly the world's worst priest. There's certainly humour throughout this book, but this humour becomes so dark so quickly with zero warning, and really it crosses the boundary from comedic to downright disgusting and disturbing. We're using a lot of D words today. The reason that Lapvona is on this list is that there is an infamous scene involving a grape. If you've read this book, you know exactly which scene I'm talking about. But unfortunately, despite this small segment of the book being the most infamous online, it is not the worst part of this book. I have to respect the dedication of Ottessa Moshfegh for driving the dark humour and utter filth into the ground with this book, because it feels as if there was a checklist developed here for the darkest themes or content, and she absolutely wanted to tick each box. We have abuse of the physical, verbal, sexual varieties, animal death, murder, cannibalism, incest, you name it. It's there. Anything that would make your toes curl and to never want to pick up this book again. It's in there. This is such a hard read that I personally doesn't feel gives you much back in the way of humour or any moral teachings, despite the form apparently being a fable. The small moments of humour stem mostly from William and the priest's interactions, which display a very critical lens of religion and wealth and nobility. But honestly, the text overall is so meandering, slow, and relentlessly cruel that it becomes a slog to get through and is truly a difficult book to stomach. So that is Lapvona by Ottessa Moshfegh. Moving on to Earthlings by Sayaka Murata. This book is so bright. I feel that this has become a household name of messed up books, but I couldn't not include Earthlings in this video. Are you crazy? This is my beloved, awful book. This is a book that I actually wouldn't mind rereading, but Sayaka Murata is also one of my favorite authors, so I'm a little bit biased here. I love how 0 to 100 wacky her books are. It goes 0 to 100 so fast. Earthlings is a tale of striving to fit into society when you know deep down that you do not belong. Natsuki has grown up telling everyone that she knows that actually she is an alien, and that soon a spaceship will come pick her up to take her back to her home planet. Over time, as she grows up, she teaches herself to hold this belief back, and amongst increasing pressure to settle down and start a family, she enters an asexual marriage. However, this is with a partner who also believes that they are an alien, and they both agree to marry in order to pass as humans, without needing to have children and get on with their lives, which is clearly a theme that Murata is interested in throughout all of her books, but I'll get to that later. Natsuki also shares a special bond with her cousin, which leads into the final third of the book, where it transforms into a truly unhinged fever dream between herself, her husband, her cousin, and those trying to get in the way of them living their new lives in the rural Japanese mountains, where things ensue. I could honestly put a multitude of other Murata books on this list, but Earthlings really makes the top of this list, with the finale being what it is. Murata repeatedly features themes of intentional asexual marriages, womanhood, pregnancy, to explore female agency in modern-day Japan. But this one in particular really taps into the question of how far would you go to truly be yourself. As an autistic person, the way that Murata writes Natsuki and her perception of the world around her really resonates with me. I'm not certain if Murata intentionally wanted to mirror neurodivergent experience through Earthlings and through Natsuki's character, and the cost of assimilating into regular life and losing a part of yourself in the meantime, ignoring your true self. I don't know if that was the intention, but nevertheless, I felt it. Until the final segment, which was rough and a little ridiculous, and exactly the reason why this book is on this list. But I enjoyed it, and I think if you check your content warnings beforehand and you know vaguely what's coming for you by the end, that a lot of people could probably find this book accessible and worth the read. She is a wonderful, wonderful writer who is not afraid to write some bizarre concepts and dark themes that link to current real-world problems. Next, I want to talk about Birth Canal by D.S. Novita Rory. This was on my radar for a little while, from hearing people talk about it online and then perusing the horror bookshelves at my local bookstore, but I actually only went and picked this up for a reading challenge, and I had to choose a book set in Indonesia written by an Indonesian author. This book is also translated by the author herself, which is incredibly cool, and the first time I've come across that personally. May I also say, what a gorgeous cover. I love the color palette. Birth Canal is a multi-perspective novella that spans different time periods told by 4 separate narrators who explore womanhood in modern-day Jakarta, a Dutch East Indies-occupied Indonesia, the Netherlands, post-World War II Japan, and modern-day Japan. So I may have failed with this book being set only in Indonesia, but we move, nevertheless. This book has particular segments which are more explicit and upsetting than the others. In particular, I remember the second perspective being rough, where a daughter visits a researcher to share her mother's story, who was an Indo-Dutch girl who had been captured by the Japanese military and forced into prostitution. The other very dark section is the third chapter, which follows a former war photographer shortly after the American occupation ends in World War II Japan, where he meets with the wife of a traumatized ex-imperial soldier. These were particularly difficult to get through, just from the pure lack of humanity on display, and also naturally, I think that I find warfare and the impacts of war on families and those left behind more difficult to read than, for example, bizarre horror concepts or creature features. The other chapters also do tackle dark, sad topics as well, but they didn't stick with me just as much as these ones did. And this book makes the list due to the explicit nature of the content that it talks about and just how depressing and sad it is overall. I'm going to move on to a book written in 1997 by Ryo Murakami called In the Miso Soup. This is a psychological horror featuring a huge splatterfest that left me thinking, what the fuck? Our main character Kenji is a 20-year-old tour guide in Tokyo who has just taken on a job to show Frank, who is a somewhat typical American tourist, around the city just before New Year. Throughout the book, we see Kenji growing more suspicious of Frank's ulterior motives, as Frank's behaviors become increasingly erratic and unsettling, until Kenji ultimately suspects Frank of plotting murder. Around halfway through, there is the most disgusting, vivid scene I've read in a book in a while. Murakami spends his time getting you all riled up and super tense just watching Kenji observe Frank. And he does this masterfully, but I still definitely did not enjoy this book. I think there came a point where it just became too gratuitous with its gore, and it was for the gross out factor rather than providing any value or entertainment. We're also not supposed to really like Kenji, as it's established pretty early on that he has a 16-year-old girlfriend that he totally takes advantage of and ignores, often in favor of making more money by taking on the job of showing Frank around the city. So I find this book is a good character study of Kenji and Frank, of very lonely people and how the city preys upon that, and men who take advantage of others, in particular women, to satisfy their loneliness and their needs in increasingly dangerous, violent ways. But for the grim chapters where the violence just goes overboard, this is what tipped me to put this book on the list. My next book is one that I have actually discussed before on my channel, and that is in my Storygraph Reads the World challenge video. This is another reading challenge book where I had to pick a Dutch author who'd written a book set in the Netherlands. I don't have a copy of this one as I borrowed it from my local library, and I'm actually quite glad that I didn't spend any money on this book and then that I didn't have to try and figure out what to do with the book afterwards if I did own it. This is The Discomfort of Evening, written by poet and author Lucas Reineveld. It's a literary fiction novel told from the perspective of 10-year-old Jazz from a reformist family in the Dutch countryside, following the sudden tragic death of her older brother. We then see the deterioration of her family life, which didn't seem to be perfect to begin with. They're reformists, and how Jazz then develops a warped understanding of the world and death and family. Now, this book is the epitome of this video. Never again will I read this book, and hopefully after this video I don't even have to think that I read this book. It is dire. It is chock full of violence and filth, made even more upsetting and brutal as we see it through the eyes of a 10-year-old who deserves so much better and likely doesn't even understand the depravity of what she is being put through. Past a certain point in the book, every chapter became stomach-churning, with the repeated assaults and violence inflicted upon Jazz by those around her, those who should be protecting and nurturing her. I mean, all I can say is that Lucas Reineveld clearly is a very gifted, talented author. He presents a disturbing but rich world that felt so lush when I first started the book. It's also a good exploration of grief and the impact that that can have on family and local community. But the beauty of the prose cannot and just does not override the sheer despair that this book made me feel, where I almost refused to finish it despite only having 50 or so pages left. It was relentless and brutal, and I do not feel like I gained anything from it other than having a book to put on a list like this. Now, I want to talk about a monster of a book, and that is Out by Natsuo Kurino. It sits at a solid 520 pages. It is a chunky boy, and a beautiful edition as well, I have to say. This is another Japanese crime thriller released in 1997. I'm not sure what was going on over there at that time, but oof. Out follows the story of 4 women as they work the night shift at a bento box factory. We dive into each of the women's lives who all face significant hardships in the unpaid labor that they must provide during the day, often without recognition, whilst also working the night shift in a pretty unforgiving working environment. One of the women, Yayoi, has a useless husband who never contributes to the household labor, gambles away all of their money, and abuses their 2 sons. One day, Yayoi's patience runs out and she strangles her husband to death. After confiding in her co-workers at the factory, they agree to help Yayoi dispose of the body, cementing them into an uneasy complicity as the body parts soon start to be uncovered by the police. Now, obviously, from the overview I've given, it's clear that this isn't a pleasant story to begin with. It handles topics of abuse, misogyny, ableism, poverty, and many more. But the real kicker of this book is that it's so strong throughout the entirety of the story until you reach the last portion, which goes into excruciating detail of a prolonged sexual assault. And you're in the character's mind as she experiences this, and the thoughts that crop up are extremely questionable and personally sour the overall messaging of the book. I'd say that I'm relatively tolerant when it comes to subversive thoughts, themes, messaging in media, where I'm more likely to question the creator's intentions first before immediately jumping in and thinking, the creator definitely meant X by writing in Z, therefore this is what this means, because this is shown explicitly to us on the screen or in the text. One example that I can think of off the top of my head is the awful 2021 movie, I never know how to pronounce this word, homunculus? Homunculus. It's so dark. It's got so dark so quickly. What the fuck? Okay. In the awful 2021 movie Homunculus, which is based on the manga, there is a specific scene in which an assault occurs. And the voiceover that takes place during this assault is like so egregiously awful. I thought it must have been metaphorical, or that there would be some twist, subversive reveal later on in the movie that would expose that that wasn't really what was going on, or it was like had some wider meaning that couldn't have just been that fucking awful. Like to explain why the main character had just become like an utter piece of shit out of nowhere. But no, that scene was exactly what we were seeing, and this sometimes happens in darker art. I was trying to find a way to understand Out's ending in a way that pertained to a wider meaning or a conclusion that aligned more with what I expected from the book, and I couldn't really find it. And this ending is quite divisive amongst those who have read it, from those who thought it completely ruined the book, cheapened the experience, and then think that that chapter shouldn't have even existed in the book whatsoever, to those who then did find a deeper meaning from that chapter. I went into this book with open curiosity because I'd been told beforehand that there was a horrific scene at the end, so I knew what was coming, but still, I did not expect that to come. I think perhaps I would reread Out, but when it gets to that chapter, I would perhaps just skip it and read like right to the end instead of that part. The penultimate book I have is The Wasp Factory by Ian Banks. It felt remiss to not include The Wasp Factory on a list like this, as I think it was probably my introduction to darker literature that I felt quite drawn to, despite also being disgusted and confused by. I'm not sure how much depth I can go into The Wasp Factory because it's actually been a decade or so since I've read it, around 15 or 16, which is much too young to be reading The Wasp Factory, by the way. But the general overview is that our main character, 17-year-old Frank, lives on a remote Scottish island with his father. And Frank spends most of his time engaging in ritualistic routines, trapping and killing wasps and other animals, and getting drunk with island locals. This book is dark and cutthroat from beginning to end, with consistent, somewhat flippant violence towards animals, and that was what was heavily criticized upon its release. And there's a crazy reveal at the end that absolutely blew my mind, made me very uncomfortable. I imagine, without spoiling too much, being who I am today would probably make me even further uncomfortable, but I don't know how well The Wasp Factory has aged. Who am I to judge it from a 2025 perspective? There's definitely also humor to be found in The Wasp Factory, but very much dark and twisted humor in nature. So be warned. I think it's even featured on a certain list of like the top 100 books of all time. It's a good book. It is just horrible. The final book I want to talk about is Tell Me I'm Worthless by Alison Rumfitt. I discovered this book a little over a year ago. I read it in the summer, and girls, it is not a beach read. I made a mistake. I fear that this book has grown in relevance, sadly, over the past year in the UK with rising fascism, racism, anti-immigration and transphobic rhetoric, all of the lovely things that we deal with nowadays. Tell Me I'm Worthless is actually a gothic haunted house novel set in Great Britain, or Albion, with two main characters, Alice and Isla. One night prior to the start of the book, Alice and Isla, alongside with their friend Hannah, spent a night in a local abandoned house rumored to be haunted. Alice and Isla, previously friends and united, leave traumatized on completely opposite ends of the spectrum and without their friend Hannah. The book then follows Alice and Isla as they navigate their lives now, post-haunted house, and the trauma that has hung above them since that night. I don't want to go any further into this book because it will become spoilery, and this book deserves a read without being spoiled. But it is brutal, and likely even more upsetting now than it was when I first read it, due to everything being fucked up in the world right now. There is an amazing chapter, and it also just so happens to be the most explicit and horrific chapter, where we get two different character perspectives happening at the same time, laid out on the same page in two columns. And it's the first time I've seen an author do this so effectively, particularly since at this point in the novel, you've been sat here thinking, what the fuck happened in this haunted house? Where the fuck is Hannah? The way that the author portrays this message is that there's always two sides to the story, and you're never going to know which is the correct one, particularly in an environment that is inherently haunted by what? It's fascism. Well, I've just realized that makes it sound like this book is like both sidesy. This book is not both sidesy. I'm going to tell you to hang in there because there's a perspective of one of the characters which is difficult to read. It is not a politically popular opinion from most people. If you're trans in particular, it's not going to be a fun ride, but it's a great book. It's a wonderful, wonderful horror book. This video title has failed me slightly again, because I would actually recommend this book to a select few people who perhaps already have an interest in UK politics, in anti-fascism and trans activism, things like that, and also horror. But this is also an upsetting, disturbing novel that is a masterclass in withholding information and building tension. Anyway, that's the end of the video. I hope you enjoyed it as much as you can when discussing a range of horrors. I like to make videos on books, typically translated fiction, horror, and feminism, so if that sounds like something you're also interested in, feel free to subscribe, and I hope to see you in another video soon. Bye bye.